Okay, let's get started. Are there any TRC members who are just calling in and not whose names aren't showing up? I just want to make sure I have everyone. Okay, Julie, did you have any notes before we start getting into the agenda?
No, just one thing, just as a reminder, if you're not a TRC member, please leave your phones on mute. You are only able to passively listen and not participate. So we just ask that you keep that in mind. For TRC members, just remember that we need to continue working on getting our TRC evaluations in. If you have questions, please email me. I did send out a list earlier in the week where the CDC staffer that Michelle graciously offered was able to complete 115 CRs, or roughly 20%. So that has really helped. But just, again, make a focus to get that done. Just a couple of updates on what the next steps are, so everyone's aware. This will complete the calls for the TRC CR review. We still have a couple of outstanding email agendas that need to be filled out and completed. And I think, Amanda, we have another one yet to send. But this will be the final call. Please get all of your outstanding votes in so we can close out those CRs. The next step is, once the TRC evaluations are finished and submitted, approximately on the 19th, we'll be releasing all CRs for a second round of public comment. The TRC will largely be disengaged at that point up until the vote the code. After the vote the code, we'll reconvene the TRC for our what will hopefully be a final call to address any changes that may come out of caucusing or member comments. So don't know how many there will be. That is to be an unknown, but we'll address those at that point. As a reminder for all, if you're a member of CMAC, or even if you're not, go ahead and get registered for the Vote the Code conference. Those dates are October 21st through 24th. It is virtual. It is free for all CMAC members, and non-member participation is $100. So please get registered today so we can make it a really bang-up conference. Outside of that, I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda and have a good meeting.
Okay, thanks, Dewey. We actually don't have any more new email voting to do. We should be done with that. So just make sure that you get in. Dewey will start sending nastygrams soon for anything that he's missing from you for the TRC members. Because we really need to get all the votes in so that we can have official votes so that the champions can write up the CR evaluations. So why don't we get started? We have a short agenda today, so hopefully we'll get done and you'll have time to go do some evaluation forms. The first CR on the agenda is 410-421-0001. Michelle, I believe that was your CR?
Yes. What? Oh, hey, yeah, it was. It was the one I accidentally presented last week when I was talking about another CR. So let me just pull that one up. All right, 410-421. Okay, so this CR talks about increasing the number of cleansing showers. So it calls for having a cleansing shower shall be one per sex for each 200 bathers based on theoretical peak occupancy is how it was rewritten. Up until now, the MAC has said it sets a limit as a number of cleansing showers shall be one per sex, less than 4,000 square feet. So it's really honestly based on the surface area of the aquatic venue. The pro of this CR would be more showers available to swimmers. The con for this CR would be the submitter might have overlooked the the fact that there are cleansing showers available, and that, you know, the annex did kind of address this. They said they went to the people when we put this text in, that they were looking for data, and there was a lack of data on the cost and on the science that really made them push beyond the surface area. There were no public comments on the CR, and like I said, the annex calls for more research to address in future editions. So they didn't feel like they had the data to really back going beyond the surface area as they had. Any questions, concerns?
What do you recommend this one?
On this one, I'm kind of torn. I'm all for showering, but I don't know where you draw the number. And given that there aren't data, I guess I'm not aware of any data. I did look at the literature, and I didn't find anything new based on what's already in the annex.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, you know, lagoons and some of these venues that we're talking about, you know, putting in that have huge, huge surface areas, but maybe not that increase in the bathe load. Yeah, whether surface areas really appropriate, but like you said, how do you pick a number out of your hat?
Yeah, I would love to, like I said, I agree. I would love to increase the number of showers and put and station showers so that you can't really get to the deck without passing a shower. But I don't know where you set the limit, and I guess I'm stuck where the original writers of this are stuck. And what was the first part you said? Because I had a reaction to that too.
Just thinking about the huge surface area venues like lagoons that we've been talking about.
So with the lagoons, I'm not so worried because I think then you could base it on the swim area versus the non-swim area. I don't think you would calculate the whole surface area. I think you would just the swim area, surface area.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
We're already requiring.
There's still the requirement for one rinse shower near an entry point to each aquatic venue for a rinse shower.
Right.
Yes.
So these are specifically cleansing showers that
correct
are here.
Is there anything that says what the current requirements are inadequate?
Let me pull up the CR. There was an argument that everybody wouldn't be able to shower if you had a bigger venue, that it would just be impossible for everyone to take a cleansing shower before. The CR did not acknowledge the rinse showers in that.
I guess I'd be curious to know what, like, general, if I don't even know if building code addresses this, you know, and what type of ratios there are.
Actually, Amanda, I was going to bring that up.
Okay.
I'm just looking at the plumbing code, the 2018 International Plumbing Code, and it would seem going to 200 bathers would be a lot more conservative than what's in the plumbing code. It looks like the plumbing code would recommend 1 per 75 for males and 1 per 40 for females. So, I mean, I'd be okay with this. I don't know about the number 200 per se. Maybe that can be adjusted, but I like the move to basing it on the number of bathers instead of square footage.
Well, I'm also going to check the theoretical peak occupancy. Just in terms of what the average, you know, square feet per bather for determining capacity, you know, for 4,000 square feet, you know, in general, what would be the range of bathers that would be allowed in that type of surface? Obviously, it varies by aquatic venue, but I'm just curious to know, you know, how many people that would be expected to be in a venue that large.
So I was able to pull up the CR. Can I share my screen, or is that possible? Or
I think if Dewey gives you privileges, you should be able to.
Dewey, Dewey, can you help me out?
Oh, I'm sorry about that. There we go. There you go, Michelle.
Okay, let me try that again. Okay. All right.
So for the range of theoretical peak occupancy, it's the surface area divided by, of the aquatic venue divided by the density factor. And the density factors in the MAHC right now range from 20 square, 10 to 20 square feet per bather for the various aquatic venues. So if you're thinking, for the 4,000 square feet,
so that's probably what the submitter put in here, thinking, okay, if based on the current language, here I'll highlight it, based on the current language, 4,000 square foot interactive water play play venue would equate to 400 bathers if we're going to 10. And then whereas it could go to 20, but in either case, the 400 bathers or 200 bathers within this code wouldn't be able to all shower. He's saying even if they showered,
providing one per sex, but so basically two showers per 4,000 square feet. Yeah. Plus the rinse shower. I assume that, if the rinse shower is provided, people are probably using the cleansing showers after swimming, but, I'm not sure.
For the plumbing code that you quoted earlier, sorry, I didn't catch who it was speaking earlier about the plumbing code, where it was 1 per 75 people. What kind of venue was that for?
Oh, I need to take that back. That was toilets, not showers. And I got to looking at the International Swimming Pool and Spa Code. That does go by square footage, 7,500 square feet. I think it requires 7,500 square feet of water area. And I don't know, it's a lot different. So I take it back. Don't compare this to the MAHC. It's very different.
Yeah, I was looking at that ANSI standard as well, and it is 7,500 gross square feet of water area, requires 1 male and 1 female shower. And then as you get beyond 7,500, that increases a little bit there.
so the MAHC is more conservative.
Correct.
And I guess in terms of consistency between the two, it's, for new construction, they'd obviously have to go with the most conservative, but if we go with the number of bathers, then it's going to be a little bit more difficult to determine, I guess, if you're trying to comply with both. But essentially the MAHC almost requiring twice as many showers based on the surface area differences of 4,000 versus 7,500.
Yeah, and I'm not sure the ANSI standard differentiates very clearly between cleansing showers and rinse showers, because it does say that the standard shall permit up to half of the shower units to be located on the pool deck or at the pool entrance.
Okay, and then for the MAHC, actually, I think there was something where, hold the section again, that if the venue's over a certain size, they can do.
There can be a mix. You can decide what the mix and the proportion is.
Right.
So like 25% have to be cleansing, or like 25% have to be rinse, and then the rest can be a mix. What you decide.
Right, and that's actually for 7,500 square feet or more water area. So that actually seems like that section's intended to make it more in line with the FPSC. And I don't know if that section becomes more difficult if we have a 200 bather requirement for the current section that we're discussing. So does anyone have strong feelings one way or another about the CR?
Me personally, I don't know what has changed. I couldn't find anything new in the literature to say we should go down or up.
I mean, the rationale is that, or the estimated cost for the submitter that I can see on the screen is really that it's arbitrarily based on water surface, but, to some degree, when you're looking at the theoretical peak occupancy, it's not so arbitrary. I mean, the proposed number is based on essentially theoretical peak occupancy. So because there's a way to calculate, the square footage of the venue and then, the capacity for that, I don't see that calculating showers on the same basis is really, you're still going for the maximum number, allowed. To some degree, I mean, and I guess, in theory, the facility could always, for new construction, and that's what this is for, always choose to put in additional showers, if they feel like they're going to be used more, like, say it's a competition pool or something where they're expecting everyone to be showering, especially afterward. But it seems like, I don't know if there's enough rationale provided to substantiate it.
Change. So how much, just to give a ballpark, how much would it cost to put in a new cleansing shower? I mean, just out of curiosity, is there any sense?
For a cleansing shower?
Yeah.
Oh, it'd have to be connected to the sanitary sewer. That's one. You have to have all the plumbing.
So we're talking thousands of dollars, right?
Yeah, it's not inexpensive.
Yeah. So I guess that's what held them back before, and I don't think we have any new data to say we can move forward and change the code as it's written right now. So I guess, Amanda, what I'm saying is I agree with you.
Yeah, I'm leaning towards a no.
I agree.
So would anyone strongly recommend a yes? Otherwise, I think we can take a vote. Okay, so for 410421-0001, would anyone recommend a yes vote on this DR? Okay, hearing none, I'll record that as a recommended no vote for this CR, and we can move on to 64226-0001.
Okay. All right, so this one talks about signage, and specifically signage for cryptosporidium. Let me just pull it up on my other screen here. Okay, so the submitter reported the need to educate patrons and bathers about crypto. The positives of the CR are that crypto is a leading cause of treated recreational water-associated outbreaks, which disproportionately impact young children and bathers, and it can lead to life-threatening wasting and malabsorption in those with weakened immune systems. The downside of the CR is that it's somewhat already addressed, not crypto specifically, but 6.4.2.2.3 about sign messages calls for not swimming with diarrhea. And I think if we're going to try to specifically address crypto, we might as well also start specifically addressing Legionella, which is the leading cause of death associated with illness, recreational water associated illness. So I guess the downside would be how much language is too much language in signs posted, and how many signs do we want posted up. There were no public comments. The annex, there was no text provided either way to support or not support. And then, what was my other comment here? Yeah, do we potentially want to take this text that was proposed to be added into the annex, or proposed to put in the code, and then add it to the annex?
Yeah,
and maybe suggest.
Yeah, it almost reads as though it's annex material. It doesn't even read as, the way it's written, it doesn't even read as code language, really, the second part of it anyways.
I agree. I mean, there's not too much in terms of preventative for Legionella either. You know, it's more that if you have, you know, health risks, you know, you're immunocompromised, or, you know, pre-existing conditions, then, you know, it's just more about being careful in general. I don't know if it's specific just for crypto. I mean, you know, if we got a question from an operator about, you know, a patron that had, you know, skin grafts for burns and about swimming with open wounds, and it just seemed like, you know, those are types of things that, you know, medical professionals, I just don't, sometimes it seems like the question of protecting yourself if you have a weakened immune system, you know, I think that patron education is good, but again, people don't read signs too much that we know, and there's also additional signage required in the hygiene facility and at diaper changing stations, in addition to just the pool area. So I don't know if people would be if there's too much signage by the time you're starting to post specific for crypto and
for crypto, Legionella, maybe even Pseudomonas, right? I mean, those are the three leading causes of the outbreaks.
I mean, it's basically telling you, don't swim if you have open wounds, don't swim if you're ill with diarrhea, you know, don't swallow or spit water. I mean, really, you know, this is signage intended to not only keep the pool cleaner, but also protect patrons who are going in the pool from getting illnesses as well. So I'm fine with, you know, having stuff like that in the annex. I think if anything, it should be even more general and just, you know, maybe not highlight crypto, but also things like Legionella, because it's, you know, a huge concern in recent years at pools and spas.
And will probably become a bigger one as we're shutting down buildings and reopening them.
Right.
With the pandemic.
Plus, if you want to add signage, it should be something more general, like if you have an immune compromised system, consult your physician before swimming. I mean, it doesn't need to be all of this. It could be very simple.
Yes.
Yeah, I second. That would be entirely too wordy for a sign.
I mean, we do have specific, you know, health type language on spa signs, and, you know, I can see maybe putting a single statement, you know, on the required signage, you know, if you're immune compromised, check with your healthcare provider, but I can't see putting all this language up.
And there's an increased risk to a lot of groups outside of just immunocompromised persons, right? Somebody who has a a hard condition. We're not calling that out specifically in this signage at the front gate that says that, you know,
Nope.
physical activity could lead to, you know, whatever with folks who have a heart condition, or, you know, call out folks who have COPD and breathing difficulty or respiratory ailments. So I just think it crosses the line a little bit. It's a little bit too much information. It's those folks,
Agreed.
they know they're at a higher risk, anyone who's got those conditions. I'm not opposed to annex information, though.
I agree with Joe.
Yeah, I do as well.
So would anyone strongly recommend a yes vote on this, or want to counter all that, or where should we take a vote? Okay, so for CR 64226-0001, is there anyone that would recommend a yes vote on this CR? And note that if we recommend a no vote, we can still suggest that this or something similar be added to the annex. Okay, hearing no comments, I'll record that as a no vote for CR 64226-0001, and let's move on to 65311-0001.
Okay. All right. So this this CR, let me just go back here, reported. Hold on. Sorry. The need. There it is. The need to revise the formed fecal contamination or GRDF response based on the CYA ad hoc committee's paper about CYA and just regular swimming. It's not fecal shedding, but it's just regular swimming. So based on one of the pluses of taking the CR is that it's based on the paper. One of the, I guess, things not going for the CR is there seems to be disagreement in public comments about, you know, questions. There seem to be questions about the volume of fecal input, about the increase in the chlorine levels, and why can't chlorine levels be increased even more. There are questions about readiness of the second model the CYA committee is building out. So both the public comment, the person who submitted the public comment, and the person that submitted the CR are on the CYA ad hoc committee. The Disinfection Water Quality TSC said there was agreement on the procedure steps 1 to 3, measuring the CYA concentration, choosing the concentration to be used, and calculating the ratio. However, we recommend adding to the table, and I'll show you the table here. Let me just recommending adding to the table, you know, in the annex examples at 20 parts per million, 30 parts per million, and 50 parts per million, or that were more realistic. Personally, as someone from CDC, I think this would mark the first time that remediation guidelines, whether we're talking about blood, feces, or vomit, or whether we're talking about remediating with Legionella being in the water and the hot tub being associated with a Legionnaire's disease outbreak, this would be the first time CDC hasn't authored remediation guidance. So I definitely have a position on this one.
So Amanda, and how would that impact the guidelines that you put up on your website that are separate from this? I mean, what's in the MAC is based on the guidelines that are published on CDC's website. So how would this impact those if the MAC was changed?
I would like to see CDC author remediation guidelines and then the MAC adopt them, honestly.
I agree. I
mean, that's the way we've always done it, and I would like to see us continue doing it that way.
Yeah, I think it's more CDC purview to determine that, and then do, you know, what they find is the data shows.
This is Dewey. I would agree with that as well.
So Michelle, what does that process look like for someone who is from the outside? And would this CR be a part of that discussion process from the CDC's perspective?
So usually what we do is we take a publication, a scientific publication, we go through it, and then based on that science and any other scientific publications that are available or data that are available, we write the recommendations, and it goes through our clearance process here.
And I'm guessing that
So
would, I'm sorry.
how different it is, I don't, without taking the time of like sitting down and writing it, I can't tell you how on or off it would be compared to what's written here. I would have to sit down and think about it.
Right. I would assume that process would take longer than the next edition's release.
No, not at all. So basically, I could get a whole MMWR report that's not written on COVID. I could probably get that through clearance at CDC within 2 weeks, 2-3 weeks. I think, I mean, my gut reaction, and not having sat down and reading the Falk et al. Paper in detail from the perspective of writing such guidance, which would go through clearance through Vince Hill and then go through clearance through Michael. Without having said that, I will say our data suggests that we don't have a problem with giardiasis outbreaks. So I'm not sure how much we would change. That's not having sat down and read the paper in detail. But I will tell you from 2000 to 2014, there were 4 outbreaks caused by Giardia that were reported to CDC. Now that pales in comparison to crypto where there are 212. But I would be, if Giardia was a problem where we had to go to 50 parts per million or 10 parts per million for 9 hours, I would expect to be seeing many more outbreaks. But where we're going to land on this, I'm not prepared to say.
I had another question regarding the ratios. Did we, am I thinking about something else when we talk about the ratios here? Did we vote on what that ratio needed to be on previous change request?
We did, and now the ad hoc committee for cyanuric acid has asked us to revisit that, so that's going to be later on the agenda today.
Okay, so I'm not sure how this table here would correlate with what that CR is going to look like, but the two should at least match if we're going to vote yes.
Can I speak? This is Ellen, or not?
I always like to hear you, Ellen.
Well, I need
I think we've allowed
because this is my
to
CR.
provide rationale before.
I'm sorry, what?
I was just going to say that we've allowed CR submitters who are on the TRC to provide a little rationale in past calls. So I think that, you know, you could do that.
Okay, this is based just solely on CT values. So the current remediation protocol is based on a CT value of 45 parts per million, minutes till Giardia. And since we know HOCl is the primary sanitizer that's doing the killing, and you can figure out how much HOCl you have depending on how much cyanic acid you have. This is just doing the math. So it doesn't have anything to do with the paper as far as the risk calculation. The HOCl calculations that were in the model, so that you can calculate the HOCl, figure out when you add more cyanic acid, it's going to take longer to kill Giardia. This is how the numbers work out. So it's just going to a CT value based on HOCl instead of a CT recording.
Gotcha.
I think another thing to consider is if, the TRC does, recommend a yes vote on a ratio for cyanuric acid, then, you're doubling the inactivation time, but we are going to have, it'll be required from an operational standpoint to better maintain, that ratio for effective chlorine disinfection. So that would improve not only, general operation, but also, cases where they need to remediate for incidents.
Well, the other perspective to consider is that CDC has the right at the end of the day to decide which direction they want to go. So as the TRC, I'm not sure we need to consider who's writing the change request or who's writing the new language. We should vote on the CR as proposed, and then CDC can decide if they would prefer that come from them, and then, sort of disregard our vote. But I don't know that we should vote based on who's authoring the change. I think we should vote on the CR itself and allow CDC to say, no, that needs to come from us, and then they can go down that road. Just a perspective.
I'm not sure what kind of precedent that would set, but I would be concerned about it kind of things potentially slipping through the cracks. And so I think it would be more clear if the TRC felt that, this type of guidance should remain within CDC's purview. And, they can certainly take, comments from the public or whatnot, about improvements to the guidance. But, if we feel that this is really CDC's guidance, then, I think that we should take that into account for our recommendation.
Yeah, and that's something we have done, whether it was blood contamination guidance that we put out or fecal contamination or the Legionella remediation. I mean, we write that here at CDC. We do take feedback from pool operators, from state health departments, from local health departments, like, hey, you should word this way, or you should do this way. But based on the science itself, we haven't gotten feedback. I do remember when we rewrote the guidance to go from, I think it was 9,600 to 15,300 for crypto in terms of the CT inactivation value. I do remember we said close the pool, and the feedback we got from multiple health departments is, what, you're telling us to close the pool for the rest of the season? And we're like, no. So then we changed the language to close the pool to swimmers. Like, that's the kind of feedback in the minutia we get involved in. We do take public comments seriously. Because when you're putting together guidance for the whole country, you're not going to think about how all 330 million people are going to read something. You just can't. So.
So does anyone else have any comments or questions before we take a vote? Okay, so would anyone on the TRC recommend a yes vote for 65311-0001?
If I can vote, I would definitely vote yes. I don't know if I need to recuse myself since I'm the author.
That would be appropriate to recuse yourself.
Yeah, I think I would vote yes.
Okay, let me see if we have enough people. Would anyone else vote yes? Okay, as far as I know, Jason and James are not on the call, but that would still give us, with Ellen abstaining and Joey yes, that would still give us 9 members voting no, and that would be enough for consensus for a no vote on this CR. So I'll note that we had 1 yes vote and 9 no votes and 1 abstains. Okay, let's move on to CR 48532-0001. So this one had been originally part of the email agenda, and it was intended to be held for the call on Monday and was not. So the TRC had recommended a yes vote, but one TRC member had some concerns about the CR, which I had emailed around to everyone. So Joe, I don't know if you want to present real quick your concerns on this, and then we can take another vote on it.
Sure. So I have a number of concerns, one of which being the language that's proposed, having a chair level at or above the lifeguard's eye level while standing. I think that's almost unenforceable because I'm 5'7", but somebody who's 6'5" would require a higher chair. So I'm not sure how you go about working that. And then again, there are certain situations where elevated chairs are not really appropriate. Wave pools, for example, if you put a chair that has a seat that's 5 foot above the deck surface, and then you have 3 foot of freeboard from the deck surface to the water surface, static water, and only 3 feet of water depth there. And when the waves are on, possibly even less than that, I think we run into an issue with lifeguard injuries, or we have to completely eliminate chairs. When we eliminate chairs, that can certainly have a negative impact on vigilance of the lifeguard's ability to stay focused if they're not comfortable to some degree as they're on stand. So I think there were some other points there in the discussion. Some of the commonly used lifeguard chairs would no longer be acceptable with the language. Lifeguard chairs are intended to be placed at the edge of the pool, or should be. So there's really no room for guests to be in a guard chair and a swimming pool. At least there shouldn't be, right? So the guard's already going to be above the heads of the bathers in the chair there, in essence. And I think that the original code entry was really just to require that the chair be such that the guard's eye level is going to be above the heads of the guests, so that there isn't that direct blockage right in front of them. So I just think it creates as many issues, if not more. And I think it can become a safety issue for the lifeguards. With the point 4 of that change request that's already in the code is the chair has to also provide safe access and egress for the lifeguard, which I'm not sure it does in an emergency situation if it's that high above a shallow water pool or something along those lines. So I just have some concerns with it.
Thanks, Joe. So does anyone else have any comments or questions on this VR? Okay, so I'll note that the TRC had voted yes on this. Does everyone feel ready to take another vote on this? And I'll propose the opposite vote. Okay, so given the reconsideration here, is there anyone that would still recommend a yes vote on this CR? Okay, hearing no yeses, I will record that as a no vote on 48532-0001. Now, the next two CRs on the agenda were the ones proposed by the Artificial Lagoons Ad Hoc Committee and the Surf Pools Ad Hoc Committee. And I was noting, so we haven't gotten any revisions to the original language, which, as we discussed on the call a few weeks ago, there are some serious concerns about. And as we discussed on, I think, the call maybe on the 3rd, there's the possibility of just putting this, having it be released, something similar, once it gets worked on a little bit more as interim guidance by CDC, with the thought that this isn't ready to become part of the MAC just yet, based on the concerns that have been outlined. There's not enough time to rework it, for this change request cycle. Michelle or Dewey, is there anything additional you have to add before we take a vote on this?
No, we had an hour conversation with multiple members of the TRC and the TSCs on the call. They provided input. I don't think we got past page 1 or 2 on either of the CRs. There were multiple pages when you put it out into a Word document and start writing it out. We will be touching base with the submitters next week and starting to rework it. This was not a quick fix, and we also have not given any other CRs an opportunity to totally rewrite them, and these are going to take a total rewrite, pretty much both of them.
I guess my only feedback is, I definitely strongly encourage the TRC to go with the recommendations coming out of the committee. Just kind of echoing Michelle, there was a lot of time, a lot of work, and much discussion put in on trying to rectify some of the conflicts for the various CRs. Yeah, I just want to encourage y'all to strongly consider its adoption.
Now, Michelle, is there still the understanding that that CDC might be able to put this guidance out in the interim once it?
Yeah. So we'll be meeting with the submitters next week, and we'll start working with a broader group. Both the committees were made up of people working on surf venues or on artificial lagoons, and a lot of public health people. And I think what the committees probably need is, at least from a design construction point of view, is probably engineers who can help us work through it more. I think it was a lot of defaulting to the engineers who were already designing these venues, but it might behoove us to have other engineering input on this.
Just from a procedural point of view, since change requests can be changed after the CMAC conference, if we did a provisional no on these, with the way they stand now, I don't think that they're ready. So if we voted no on them, but then if they change in the next few weeks, that you talk to other engineers and get them into a good shape that they could be voted on. Because I think currently they're not ready, but I'd like to open that hope that they could be ready.
Now, is that allowed? Because I was under the impression we can tweak things and we can edit things, but can we massively rewrite things?
No, I think there was one occasion I can recall after the last, or during the last change request cycle, where it was, I think, determined that it would be a bigger impact than it was thought, or it wasn't necessarily considered for a specific CR. So there was, some, I think, of the CMAC leadership, there was a discussion with them and CDC to make some changes so that the impact wouldn't be as great. I think it was with the NSS 50 and 60 listings that to basically have it that if you're already listed for one, that approval is good for, you don't have to go in and get listed for NSS 50 as well. I think that's what it was. So I'm not aware of any other large scale changing of CRs after they've been evaluated by the TRC, much less gone through the conference and have been voted on by leadership, or not leadership, but members.
So it was my understanding the flotation tank text, when it was a CR, needed a lot of revision. Was that before it was submitted, or was that after?
Good question. I'm pretty sure it was before.
Okay.
But I'd have to look back in my email history. But
okay. I just wanted to check because I thought that might be a possibility, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's up to CMAC leadership and CDC to make a call, but, you know, I think as the TRC, we basically need to vote on these as it stands now, and if, you know, if they're ready for some sort of reconsideration in a few months, and it still falls within the time period, then maybe that's a possibility, but I think as the TRC, we need to just vote on, you know, what's on the table right now. So I guess with that said, does anyone have any specific comments or questions on either of these before we take a vote, or thoughts one way or the other?
Yeah, in my mind, neither one of them is ready because there's still way too much ambiguity about which parts of the MAC they're exempted from and which ones they're not exempted from. So just from clarity point of view, to make that absolutely clear, I know I was in at least one of those conversations where even on the call, no one was really sure exactly. And so I think that needs to be addressed before anything can be passed.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, let's take a vote. So for 41211-0001, this would be the CR for the artificial lagoon. Is there anyone that would recommend a yes vote on this CR?
Amanda, I'd vote for yes.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, it looks like we still have enough members for consensus on a no vote, but I will note that there was one member voting yes. It was not unanimous. Okay, and for CR 4.12-0001, is there anyone on the TRC that would recommend a yes vote on this CR? This is the surf pool CR. Okay, I'll record that the TRC recommends a no vote on the CR, and I think that we're all on the same page that, you know, that this type of guidance is needed, and that, you know, we do hope that this committee, you know, these two committees have done a lot of work and gotten a good start, and, you know, we hope that, you know, this is the type of thing that may be able to be released as interim guidance before the next change request cycle. We certainly don't want, you know, all this work to not go anywhere, but I think we're all in agreement that it's really not ready to go in the MAC just yet.
Amanda, I'm not in disagreement with that statement, but just to be consistent, my vote is yes.
For the surf pools as well?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, sure. I'll note that. I think we still have enough members voting no for no recommendation, but I'll certainly note in the notes that we have one member recommending a yes vote. Okay.
I have a question, Amanda. I'm not sure for the next go around if this needs to be completely reworked or if this is something that, and I don't know what the committee's thought would be on this either, but have this CR withdrawn as opposed to receiving a no vote, and then bring it forward for the next cycle with the additional legwork being done. I don't know if that's a better approach than a no vote here, or even if something they'd be willing to do. But if it's going to be a no recommendation here, it might be a better option.
Well, and these are, you know, even though they're submitted by an individual, and actually I think I submitted one on behalf of CMAC, these are CMAC ad hoc committees. So if the TRC feels that's the better approach, we can withdraw these.
I can follow up with the submitters.
I like where it's going. I just think it needs a little bit of work.
No, I mean, we started tackling a lot of the issues with the committees. I agree. we were given another month to work on both of them, and it just wasn't enough time. And then I think there was thought we could get to it in the spring before the TRC met, and just then the pandemic happened.
Yep.
Okay, and I think since Michelle, you're the champion, you know, if they decide to withdraw, then we can just withdraw them, and otherwise, you know, you
It's a no vote?
write them up. Yeah, with a no vote with one member recommending a yes vote, and I'll include that
Okay.
in the call summary.
So if it's withdrawn, then what Ellen suggested, the possibility of resubmitting it is no longer an option. But if it's a no vote, the CDC and CMAC leadership can decide to put it back in? Did I understand that?
I'm going to defer to everyone else because I don't know that we've dealt with that. So
I don't want to break new ground or not follow precedent, but I just want to make sure I'm communicating correctly to the submitters.
If it is withdrawn, we would need to, it would be withdrawn and not revisited this go around, if that's the question. To do so would really start impacting the transparency of the process, and I would want to avoid that. So if we do withdraw them, that would kind of lock them out until 5th edition.
But if it's a no vote from the TRC, there might be the possibility of revisiting it.
Yes, correct. Because
yes,
you know, as a reminder, any CR as we go through the caucusing, the vote, the second round of member comments, actually not the second round of member comments, but the conversation at the vote the code, that's when we have an opportunity to also improve CRs.
Okay, but the question is rewriting acceptable? And Amanda was going to look back to see if there's precedence for that.
Yeah. I am not necessarily comfortable with the rewrite.
Okay.
With this, I mean, I know we've kind of toyed with that with the cyanuric acid committee. So, I mean, I'd hate to exclude these committees as well from the opportunity, but it's setting up a really, really bad precedent that we need to try to avoid.
Okay. And I think both submitters were on board to, over the next few weeks, in time for the WAC and in time for the CMAC conference, reworking this and this being interim guidance. So I will go back to them.
okay. So now we will get to the three cyanuric acid CRs. So the CYA, the CMAC ad hoc committee, has proposed changes to 3 of their CRs. And so just I'll kind of give an overview of each, and then also where we have landed as the TRC when we addressed them initially. So the first one is 573.112-0001, and this was the one concerning the ratio for cyanuric acid. Now this is slightly different in that it's okay. Yes, I got it. Okay, so the TRC, we had a lengthy discussion on this before, and we had there are a couple different ratios put out in different change requests, and we had settled on this one, which was the 20-to-1 ratio of prechlorine to cyanuric acid. The ad hoc committee, the CMAC ad hoc committee for cyanuric acid, is now putting forward a request that we that this be changed, and they're now asking for a 30-to-1 ratio. So the other ratios that the TRC had looked at from other change requests were 15-to-1. I believe there was also one that was a 50-to-1. So this kind of, is still between those two. So I think the real discussion, and I guess, can you give me screen sharing privileges, and I'll bring up the change requests, the Word documents.
There you go, Amanda.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see here. Okay. So here's that. So basically, it's going to change. So the minimum for all aquatic venues, it would be 1 part per million free chlorine. And then for cyanuric acid, it would be a ratio not exceeding 30-to-1. And I know we had a lot of discussion and settled on the 20-to-1 last time. Essentially what's allowed now is a kind of like a 45-to-1 with the minimum FAC of 2 and the maximum CYA of 90. And just so, I'm trying to think here. So the next CR would actually be changing the allowable maximum for CYA, but I'm not sure that would impact. So with the 30-to-1, you're basically, at 90 it would be 3.0. This other change request would be which we'll discuss next, would basically allow up to 180 parts per million if you can measure that high. So with this ratio in place, you would be operating at a minimum of free chlorine residual of 6 parts per million if you wanted to go that high. So does anyone have any comments or questions? Does anyone feel like they would have approved the 20, but they wouldn't be okay with the 30? Let's discuss this one.
So this is Michelle. We met with some of the members of the CYA ad hoc committee last week to talk through the CYA CRs. At some point there was a question about the model that was published in Falk et al. That we talked about at the last WAC conference. And basically what it came down to is when you do the modeling, when you mathematically try to calculate this ratio, there is a range of ratios pops up: 20-to-1 CYA to free available chlorine to 40-to-1 CYA free available chlorine. And basically within that range, we are talking about we take into an account a 12-hour diurnal schedule. The model that was published originally made it seem as though they were bathers in the water at 24 hours. Now it was just for 12 hours, and it took into account 20 feet squared per bather. There's some debate within the committee about filter credits, and that's kind of why there is a range there. Filter credit being that the more crypto or that can be removed, the better, but we don't know how well the filter works. So there was some debate around that, and so I think, not applying the filter credit, and taking into account the need for costs of water replacement and whatnot, the committee landed at 30-to-1. So it's a bit of a tweak to the model that was published.
Does anyone else have any comments or questions?
So the model's pretty effective. The question about the model is where do you land? I mean, 20 to 1 and all the way to 40 to 1 is a wide range. So it is a bit difficult to say, here's my number, this is where I land, this is the way it is. I mean, first there's the science and wanting to minimize risk of illness, and that needs to also to some extent be measured against the MAHC, I guess, motto to some extent being revolution, not evolution, and operating costs and such. So that kind of, I hope that's kind of helping everyone kind of picture it and understand it.
Yeah, this is Amanda. I mean, coming from a state that does not allow any cyanuric acid use, I'm pretty much fine with, I see the rationale for a little bit for operational limits. I was good with the 20 to 1, although I would have preferred lower. I can see supporting the 30 to 1, if there's, in the interest of achieving consensus, ideally I would think it would be better to be lower, but I think it's certainly better than what's existing. So I would be willing to vote yes to reach it, if it helps reach consensus.
Is there any issue of the cyanuric acid? Like if our ORPs, you get to 30 or 40 parts per million in the ORP.
So on the calls I was on, the 2 calls last week with the committee, there was, I don't remember there being a discussion on ORP.
I didn't hear the full question on ORP. Could you repeat that, please?
So normally on a pool controller, if you're running 30 to 40 parts per million, you may not achieve your the 650, which is the World Health Organization says, hey, this is where you should be. So is that something that, keeping the cyanuric acid that high in the pool, that now we're in conflict with them to do that? Or having that high of a level?
30 to 40 parts per million is not a problem for a controller. Even at 650, I mean, you're well above 650 in most circumstances.
And as far as I know, World Health Organization doesn't have any enforceable standards. It's just guidelines. And I don't think that the MAHC has an ORP level.
Yeah, I should put that more succinctly and say there's no problem reaching 650 or higher with 30 to 40 parts per million of stabilizer. Interference with ORP is much higher than that.
But you would have to run your chlorine at a higher, I mean, you're running at once you get to 40, if you had 30 to 1, then if you had 60 parts, you'd have to go 2 parts per million. And you're saying you can achieve that with the ORPs?
Yeah, no problem. In most
Okay.
cases. It's not an exact, there's not linearity from pool to pool, but generally speaking, yes, that's not a problem.
Just as a
right
reminder,
now, you have a minimum of 2 parts per million anytime using, in the current MAHC, anytime using cyanuric acid anyway. Sorry, Dewey.
Yeah, excuse me, Amanda. Just as a reminder to all, this call is only intended for discussion among TRC members. While we appreciate and value all of our industry professionals' input, we do limit this call to only TRC deliberations with no external input.
So does anyone else on the TRC have any comments or questions before we vote on this CR?
I like the move to this, and I think it could, in some way, maybe help operators to understand the role or the interactions between cyanuric acid and free chlorine, which I don't think a lot currently do. So I do like having this sort of a guidance and ratio system.
I echo that. I do think this is a step forward for pool operation.
Yeah, this is Cindy. I agree with that too, but I don't think the average operator will be able to measure much above 100 anyways, unless they're buying special equipment.
We'll get to that on the next CR, but yeah. Okay, so the TRC had recommended a yes vote on the CR when it was a 20-to-1 ratio. Is there anyone on the TRC that would not continue to recommend a yes vote with this current proposal that it's now a 30-to-1 ratio?
Amanda, does this impact any of the other CRs besides the CYA CRs, besides the two we're discussing today?
I don't believe it does. There was one CR, let me just go to it. So I was looking on the call note. There was one CR that was accompanying it to change the minimum at all facilities to 1 part per million instead of just those not using cyanuric acid. But I think that's also incorporated into this current CR. And I don't believe that there's any other changes. That we already accepted the definitions and the change to use the DPD-FC terminology instead of just free available chlorine.
So I would support this, but only if we're saying that the 20-part or the 20-to-1 ratio is off the table.
I think essentially it is because the committee has come back and basically offered a 30-to-1 now. So I'm a little unclear about the whole, evolution, but essentially we have 30-to-1, or, I guess we could, in theory, go back and evaluate the other ones that came in, which I think were 15-to-1 and 45-to-1. Let me just check real quick. Yeah, I mean, the other ones that were submitted by other submitters were 15-to-1 and 50-to-1. So, I think I agree with you that I like the lower ratio, but I think this is an evolutionary step. I don't think it would be too revolutionary, and I think it'll certainly be better than what we have now, where they can have 2 parts per million, but only, with 90 parts per million cyanuric acid. So does anyone else have any comments or questions before we take a vote?
I just need to state that I need to recuse myself again.
Right, yes. Right. And we have everyone, I think, on the call still except for Jason, so we should have 12 other people that can vote. So we can take that into consideration in case there's any dissenting votes. So let's take a vote. So for CR 573-112-0001, now that it's been changed from the 20-to-1 to a 30-to-1 ratio, is there anyone on the TRC who would no longer recommend a yes vote on the CR? Okay, I'll record that as a yes vote with 1 abstention. And we can move on to CR 573-132-0004. Now this one, let me pull up real quick the call summary from June 8th. So the TRC, this is specific to changing, and I'll pull up the CR in a second. This is specific to changing the maximum allowable CYA level for from an operational standpoint. The TRC had waived several requests for doing this. One was to change it from 90 to 25. Another was to change it from 90 to 40. Another one was to change it from 90 to 60, and the one that was submitted by the CMAQ Ad Hoc Committee for Cyanuric Acid would just delete the requirement of any maximum level. And we had voted no on all 4 of these options. So I'm going to bring up on my screen, and I'll share it, the CR. So now there's a little bit of a difference in what they are proposing. Okay, so essentially it's going to allow, there's going to be an exception now. So basically they're going to keep it at 90, but provide this exception that if an operator can measure cyanuric acid concentrations as high as 200 parts per million, they're allowed to go up to 180 parts per million, as long as they maintain the ratio in section 5731122, which is what we just recommended a yes vote on for the 30-to-1. So that's the code section. And then the high range method that they can use to test can either be doing an accurate dilution or using an analytical method that can measure above 90 parts per million, or a combination of the two. And then there's a lot of annex information added about how to do dilutions and how to
way to go, cyanuric acid people.
Again, we'd ask that all members mute their lines, except if you're on the TRC and have to make a comment or question. Oops, sorry, let me bring up, this is this proposed change. So we had voted no to taking out this cyanuric acid level entirely, and now the proposal is to keep the 90 part per million limit unless the operator can measure higher, then they're allowed to go up to 180 parts per million, which personally I think that would be very hard to reduce to lower than 15 to remediate for a diarrheal fecal incident. But they would, at the 30-to-1 ratio, if they were at 180 parts per million, they would basically have to have a minimum free chlorine residual of 6 parts per million. So does anyone have any comments or questions on this CR?
Amanda, this is Michelle. I have a question. So I remember when we talked about raising the pH and talking about, well, the operators that raise the pH should work on getting equipment for the health department. If they want to operate at a higher pH, they needed to provide equipment for the inspector to do that, to test that. Are we saying the same for CYA, operating at a higher level?
I mean, I think the inspectors always like to use their own test kits. I think, if they can do the dilutions, they should be able to use the test kit that they have. They would just need to carry, I think, some distilled water around to dilute the sample.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Public health members, let me know if I'm wrong in terms of, that would provide a great operational impact or impact to inspectors out in the field. But I think that, in the annex, they did add some annex material, as to how to do dilutions.
I'm going to add to that question too. Then if you're doing the dilutions, then what's the accuracy range you're getting for those values?
So I don't know if you can see where I'm highlighting, it does say that you just multiply by a dilution factor. I'm not sure if test kit manufacturers, I think it would boil down to whether the test kit manufacturer, whatever these are tested to, the test kits are tested to, whether or not they would recommend doing dilutions with their test kit, I assume, or if that would create inaccurate readings. This actually says here that they could dilute with tap water.
Yeah, I just know in our code specifically, we have accuracy ranges that they have to be within a table that we have in our code. And I just was wondering if if at that range with dilutions, they'll be within 10 parts per million or not.
That would be a question we'd have to ask for some of the manufacturers to provide data. You know, we could look at doing that for the annex and having that information in the annex. That'd be a good place for it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if certain test kits are way off, then, you know, how well this would be, you know, would it be in the proper ranges then?
Yeah. Well, all the manufacturers do have a dilution, or at least the ones I've experienced. So I feel comfortable that the test would be at least within some sort of acceptable deviation. You know, but again, it won't help us for this call, but we can reach out to manufacturers for some information there.
And also, you know, it does say here in the procedure that, you know, you're to do your dilution, you're going to have to, you know, basically determine what the expected reading is going to be so that you can do the dilution properly. So you're going to need to, you know, that might not be, I guess, I don't know if that makes it more difficult. You know, if you're not sure what your expected range is going to be, although we had learned from other calls that the cyanuric acid levels in the pool don't really change drastically quickly.
I think that the dilution method and I think that with most of these test kits, and I haven't been able to go in and verify all of them, I'm just looking right now, I believe this puts it outside of the NSF certified range on most test kits. For instance, I know several of them are 5 to 50 parts per million on cyanuric acid, and there's really no, there's nothing noted for dilution or anything else.
So you're saying essentially that really they should only be able to do this if they have a test kit that has this range, that can measure in this range without requiring dilution. That's
Yeah, where it's actually certified by NSF or the equivalent to test accurately within that range. When NSF tests or certifies these test kits, they're all certified for various ranges of each parameter. So, you know, I don't think you can go outside of that and still be in compliance with the NSF requirement for a test kit.
I'm actually going to look at the MAHC section for water quality testing devices. I can't remember what is, if there's a requirement. So all water quality testing devices and kits shall be certified, listed, and labeled to NSF ANSI 50 by an ANSI accredited certification organization. So that's under section 47351. So it certainly seems like, you know, that they do have to have the appropriate device, and that, you know, if there's a possibility that doing dilutions, I don't know that we could recommend doing that if that's going to run counter to how these devices are certified, and they therefore wouldn't. We don't want to be recommending that they be used not in accordance with, you know, how they've been tested.
Yeah, just looking right now, there is no water quality test device on NSF. Now that doesn't mean that ETL or somebody else hasn't tested to that same standard, but there's nothing listed on NSF that goes beyond 110 parts per million for cyanuric acid. There are a couple at 5 to 50 and one at 30 to 100, but there is nothing above 110 parts per million.
So, yeah, I can't see recommending a yes vote with that, you know, given that the language, you know, discusses making dilutions, and it doesn't seem like that's going to be acceptable within how these kits are certified. You know, and there's nothing that can go up to 200 or 180.
I agree. I'm a no on this.
Does anyone else have any comments or questions before we take a vote?
I'll need to recuse myself again, Amanda.
Yes, thank you.
You're asking about no votes?
We haven't taken a vote yet. I was just wondering if anyone has any comments or questions before we vote.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a concern or not, but I know we've tried to avoid putting exceptions into the code. So perhaps that title there of exception would be something we would want to find, you know, alternate or required test kits or you know, something different than exception. I think we've tried to avoid that in the past. It doesn't bother me, but I thought that was something that we had tried to do.
Can't remember offhand. Okay, so for CR 573-132-0004, which the TRC voted no on this originally when it was to strike the 90 part per million limit. The change now is to leave the 90 part per million limit, but allow up to 180 parts per million if the aquatic venue has a test method in place of measuring cyanuric acid concentrations as high as 200 parts per million. Then they would be allowed to have up to 180 parts per million cyanuric acid as long as they're maintaining the ratio. Would anyone recommend that we change our no vote to a yes vote, given the resubmittal by the ad hoc committee?
I would vote yes for this.
I'd vote yes.
Vote yes as well.
So we had three voting yes for this with the going up to 180.
This is Jody. I would vote yes.
Amanda, while we're voting, let me point out one thing. The question of NSF certification for those high limits, that is a good question. There are existing precedents. So for example, in some free available chlorine tests, there are situations where you do have to do dilution testing. Most of them max out at 10. So you have to do dilution testing for higher ranges unless you're using the FAS DPD reagents. And then also, there are some kits where the high limit is 5. So still well within range, but those would also have to do dilution testing. So just keep in mind that we do have precedents for dilution testing, you know, aside from NSF certifications.
But aren't those approved within the NSF certification?
I'd be lying to say I knew. I would have to go back and do some digging.
Just looking on the NSF website, I see that one that goes up to 20 parts per million.
Okay, so I think we're going to need to do this one by one so that I have 4 yes votes so far. We have 12 members on the call with 1 abstaining, so now we have 11. So if we have 4 yes votes, that brings us below the 9 needed for consensus. So it appears that we're going to have to abstain from a voting recommendation on the CR.
Amanda, let me let me explain one other thing very quickly. Just as we go through and deal with these CRs, again, this can be highly charged, and there's been a lot of opinions and work on both ends by all individuals involved. I do want to point out that if we wind up in a situation where the TRC is voting on something different from what is said in these CRs, then there's a strong possibility that this would be without submitter approval. So just keep that in mind. As an example, these CRs are considered to be a package deal, quote unquote, where they're all interrelated. So there is a risk of voting yes for one CR and no for another, where, on our evaluations and as we go to devote the code, we would have to indicate that this is against submitter recommendations.
Yeah, I'm not concerned with this one in particular that, that in recommending the 30-to-1 ratio that, not recommending going up to 180 would be, a conflict. I think we can certainly take, it looks like we have 4 people recommending a yes vote. I don't know if anyone else recommends a yes vote, but that clearly brings us, with 11 members voting down to 7 if everyone else is a no, and that would, we just wouldn't have consensus. But I don't think that should, these weren't submitted as all part of the same change request, so I don't see why, they can't be evaluated separately. I don't see any conflicts in the TRC voting yes to one and not no to, or abstaining from others.
And this is just as a reminder, and in full disclosure, I am having some issues with hearing today. I've got significant background noise on my end. So I'm a little struggling to hear exactly what's being said. So if I overlap something that's already been discussed, I do apologize.
Dewey, do you feel like we're missing something on this one where by voting no on this one, is there any other impact other than it leaves the maximum CYA at 90 parts per million and doesn't impact the other votes? I'm trying to understand where the impact of this with the other CRs would be other than just leaving the maximum at 90.
This is Michelle. So when we talked to the CYA committee members, kind of talking about the closure item, making CYA at a certain level a closure item, setting an operating ratio, setting a maximum CYA level, operating CYA level. This was all part of a compromise that the committee had worked out amongst themselves to try to address kind of the conflicts between the CRs submitted by different committee members. I
don't see a direct issue. I think, I came into this call not really sure about this one, but I think, that the issues brought up with dilution and test kits and, maybe if it was rewritten to say that you had a test kit that, was clearly, able to measure within that range and give us some examples of test kits that can measure up to 200, without doing dilution. I just want to make sure that we're not going to be telling people they can do something that they would run afoul of, section 47351, that they're not using their water quality testing device, per whatever the usage that it's certified to be used for.
I agree with that, Amanda. And then you have to think about the local health jurisdictions that are out there enforcing it. If you go to court on something and that test kit isn't meeting the NSF standard, it would be thrown out the window.
And I've tried to reach out to manufacturers before on behalf of local health departments to see what the type of accuracy range was and specificity, and just got no response. So, I'm not confident that, that it would be an easy thing to do. And from the enforcement standpoint, it's going to be difficult. And obviously these are, if the operator can measure more highly, we would expect these to be operators who knew a little bit more about operation than maybe the average operator. But I also don't personally see any reason to operate up to 180 parts per million and 6 parts per million free chlorine, especially with the difficulty of diluting to respond to a diarrheal fecal incident. To go from 180 down to 15 is going to be extremely time consuming and take a lot of water replenishment before you can even start your 12 plus hour hyperchlorination process. And I don't want people to not do that process because it takes so long and just ignore the fact that somebody had a diarrheal fecal incident in the pool.
Yeah, and I would add to that a third reason, 180 parts per million trying to operate an ORP controller on a pool becomes a significant challenge. And there are thousands upon thousands of pools being operated with ORP pH controllers. That 180 would be a significant problem.
Okay, does anyone have any other comments? I mean, we have voted, and I think if anything, we should just move on to the next CR. Okay, so our final CR, sorry, Judy, did you have something? Okay, so our final CR is 6631-0005. Let me bring that up on my screen. Now, I'm also just going to, before I bring it up on my screen, give a quick overview. So this section is on imminent health hazards. So right now, the imminent health hazard section of the MAHC does not have any imminent health hazard for exceedance of any level of cyanuric acid. We had a couple of different change requests with respect to that, 3 of them. One was that it would be an imminent health hazard if the GPD free chlorine to cyanuric acid ratio exceeded, or cyanuric acid to GPD free chlorine ratio exceeds 45:1. Another one was to add an imminent health hazard exceeding any of the maximum cyanuric acid levels listed in the various sections of the MAHC. The TRC had felt that exceeding 90 parts per million cyanuric acid wasn't justifiable as an imminent risk to health and safety. The one that was submitted by the ad hoc committee originally was to add the specific imminent health hazard levels section, so basically below 1 part per million, and then for spas at the minimum level, and then also 3 parts per million, and then also bromine, and then so basically adding them into the imminent health hazard section and not just referring back to the operational section of the code. And that was, I think, in part because of the new ratio for cyanuric acid, because essentially as the imminent health hazard section reads now, it just references the minimum residuals listed in the code and doesn't provide anything different. They also wanted to add a minimum or PYA above 300 parts per million as an imminent health hazard. So now we'll go on to what they're now in this. Again, the TRC has voted no for all 3 of these proposed changes. Now I'm going to share my screen and bring up the change requests that we're now going to weigh. Here. Okay, so this one here, it'll change the second imminent health hazard to failure to provide the following minimum disinfectant residual levels. So instead of referencing the ones already in the code, it's going to have an imminent health hazard if the GPD FC concentration is for venues that use chlorine sanitizers. GPD free chlorine concentrations below 1 part per million while also not exceeding a ratio of 45:1. For spas, it would be below 3 parts per million, which is the minimum in the MAC already. And then for aquatic venues or spas using bromine, the minimum is already listed in the operational section. So the main for spas using chlorine sanitizers below 3 parts per million, which I'm a little confused because I'm not sure what the minimum.
The minimum is 3.
For spas using chlorine sanitizers?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's all spas. That's a little confusing because.
No, I think the level's higher for
see.
bromine. It's a higher minimum for bromine.
Yeah. Well, the minimum for all spas is 3 parts per million. But I think that in recognition, but cyanuric acid cannot be used at spas for new construction.
Yeah.
So, but I think the idea is that now the spas have to maintain 3 parts per million, but if there are ones that are in existence using chlorine sanitizers or cyanuric acid, the idea is that that they also, I assume, also can't exceed that ratio, or just because I'm getting confused. Okay, so I assume that any spa that uses cyanuric acid a spa would have to maintain the 3 parts per million and then also the proper ratio. But that would be true operationally too, because they already have that higher ratio and the other CR didn't propose to change that. Sorry. Okay, and then finally, it would make a cyanuric acid concentration above 300 parts per million a public health hazard. So the 300 parts per million, we discussed that last time. That was the World Health Organization, I think, limit for toxicity.
Actually, that number came from NSF.
Oh, sorry. Okay. And it says this CR is aligned with the concept of a maximum free chlorine CYA DPD free chlorine ratio and will need to be adopted if an operational ratio CR is adopted in order to operate under a CYA DPD free chlorine ratio as it is intended. It's proposed to be adopted in conjunction with CR 573132-0004. Further justification to follow and be provided soon. I don't know that we've received anything. So I know last time the 45:1, I think that we had discussed that might not be necessarily, an imminent health hazard. Although, at this point, if this is not added to the MAC, then they're going to end up, if they exceed the 30:1 ratio, it will be an imminent health hazard. The way the MAC is currently written, because it just references the minimum disinfectant in various sections of the code and doesn't provide anything right here. So I think that's probably the biggest concern here is even if the TRC doesn't necessarily feel like exceeding a 45:1 ratio is an imminent health hazard, which we can discuss, but if we felt that wasn't, then certainly exceeding 30:1 wouldn't be. And I know we had discussed a little bit about cyanuric acid concentrations above 300 parts per million and the ability to even measure that high with inspectors in the field. And that I think this is a chronic toxicity level and not necessarily acute. And it's also, probably several degrees of orders of magnitude under what the actual level is. So why don't we discuss this one?
I'm not necessarily opposed to the first part of it, the 45-to-1. Agree that it's not it doesn't reach a level of toxicity, but I still have concerns about how we could test cyanuric acid concentrations above 300 anyway. I struggle with that. It doesn't seem to be accurately testable, at least from many of the test kits that I've seen.
And I would say that with our concerns about dilution, the measurement range, that they talked about in the other CR was if you do it to a dilution factor of 3, you could get readings in the 90 to 300 part per million range. So while it might be something that could be done with an existing test kit, again, Cindy's concerns about, about when you're taking enforcement action and the questions of whether or not, the test kit was intended to do this or the accuracy at these ranges, I think that would be a valid concern, for the part of local health departments or authorities having jurisdiction that are going to be actually citing this violation and, potentially taking enforcement action for it.
One thing to keep in mind, and this may not be necessarily the answer people want to hear, but it may be the best approach to take right now. Having the 300 part per million, even though there may be some testing issues, this does prove or pose rather as an evolutionary improvement to the MAC, in that it does put in a max limit, and 300, again, that comes from EPA, so we do have that toxicity data testing that we can rely on. So that's just one thing to keep in mind as we go through these discussions.
Yeah, I would echo what Dewey said. This is Michelle. I would say that starting to think about operating pools in terms of ratios, whatever that ratio is, and starting to set up closure consequences for really extreme levels of CYA would be a step forward for public health.
I'm also in agreement with those statements.
I don't disagree with that, but then looking at it, is it adoptable by AHJs?
I'm in agreement with the sentiment of all of that for sure. I just question whether it can really even legitimately be tested for. And this is coming from someone who has done many times the dilution test with a standard test kit, but I don't know whether that's actually accurate or not, is my concern. I won't go down this rabbit hole, but I agree with it.
There are lots of states that already have closure limits that are 100 or less. Some even have like 30. It seems that, that this 300 limit is not really in line with what any state is currently doing. I mean, the max I'm aware of is 100. And it seems that this would be three times that with, would make it maybe not palatable for a lot of states.
I think it's a limit, but it's an imminent health hazard. That's the other question. I think, like in ours, the limit is 90, but it's not an imminent health hazard.
I mean, also our hands are kind of tied here, because if we don't, recommend a yes vote, then in recommending the ratio and the others, these two are really tied together in a sense, because if we recommend the change in the operational section with that ratio of 30 to 1, and we don't modify this section, then the 30-to-1 becomes the default imminent health hazard. So I think that that's an issue. But I mean, with respect to the 300, I feel like there's a lot bigger chance that they're going to exceed that minimum, that the 45-to-1 ratio, well before, you know, I mean, they're going to, if they have 300 parts per million free chlorine, it's essentially, you know, with a 30-to-1 ratio, they can, or 300 parts per million cyanuric acid, they pretty much, you know, have to be running at 10 parts per million free chlorine all the time, which is the maximum limit for free chlorine in the code. So, you know, I feel like they're going to run afoul of the imminent health hazard of not maintaining a 45-to-1 or lower ratio before they would exceed the 300 parts per million cyanuric acid.
Hey, Amanda, procedurally, I don't know if you want to consider this or not, but there is that other change request that just has the 45-to-1 closure rule without the 300 part per million cyanuric acid limit. It's 6631-0003. So that's not the one that came from the committee, but it is just simply a 45-to-1 ratio and doesn't include the 300.
Even to determine the 45-to-1 ratio, you'd have to measure 180, 250 parts per million CYA to even know you were getting toward the 300 limit.
Exactly. And is the argument there then for when we're talking about the 30-to-1 ratio for operation, can we use that argument again? If you can't measure past 90 or 110. And we already voted yes on that CR.
So I honestly, Dewey, I'm not sure what our procedure should be in terms of, I would say that, you know, James had brought this up. We were going to rediscuss it on the call, and then we were made aware that the ad hoc committee was going to make some changes in general, so we tabled it. But this did come up after our call on the 8th, that we basically, when we accepted the 20-to-1 ratio, we were essentially making that also a public health hazard the way the MAC was written. So we were going to readdress all of these imminent health hazard change requests again in light of that. So I think that does kind of suggest that we would be able to reconsider it in a larger discussion. But you know, are there members who, I guess we should figure out you know, how we would vote on this specific one, and then, you know, if there's members that are okay with the 45-to-1 as the IHH, but not okay with the 300, then maybe we should think about whether we need to revisit the other CR that's related, and whether we would reach consensus on that, you know, in the interest of not having the 30-to-1 become a default as the imminent health hazard.
But Amanda, is it an imminent health hazard? Right now, I guess if I had an inspection form based on these CRs and the rest of the code or whatever, right now, in my mind, without accepting this CR as it stands and leaving the MAC as it is with its imminent hazards, right now what we're saying is, yeah, you should be at 30-to-1, but we're not closing you if you're not.
Well,
so
it says failure to provide the minimum disinfectant residual levels.
But this is with adding it in, and what I'm arguing is that right now, or let's just look at the MAC the way it is right now, minus all these CRs. Right now, the MAC reads 90 parts per million CYA tops, and in imminent hazard, CYA isn't mentioned. So if an inspector came in and found the CYA at, let's say, 125, it would just be a checkbox on the inspection form, and we move on. So I think possibly writing up a closure here is a step forward.
Yeah, I think that the idea is that because the current language says not for CYA, but for disinfect for chlorine, failure to provide the minimum disinfectant residual levels listed in various sections of this code. Because in section 5.1.3.1.1.2.1, we're changing, instead of all aquatic venues using cyanuric acid requiring a minimum of 2 parts per million, now we're going to require, the minimum is going to be whatever is needed to maintain that 30-to-1 ratio. So essentially, if they're not meeting that minimum, it now becomes a public health hazard because it's directly, the MAC is referencing various sections instead of having that any language specifically in the imminent health hazard section.
It seems to me that that this 300 limit is actually because of the 45-to-1 ratio. So the 45-to-1 ratio would actually be 450 at 10 ppm of chlorine. So this would just kind of cut that off before it got that far. So I think this is actually more conservative.
Well, and just as a reminder, the 300 ppm limit for cyanuric acid comes from the EPA and them labeling levels above there as toxic.
So I guess, is there anyone, why don't we weigh this both ways? So for 6631-0005, is there anyone that would recommend a no vote on this CR? And then I'll boil down to whether those people who would recommend a no vote would be okay if we took out the 300 parts per million maximum. And basically, if you're exceeding the 45-to-1 minimum, then you're at an imminent health hazard. So essentially, if you're going above 10 parts per million free chlorine with the 30-to-1 ratio, you're at an imminent health hazard that way because you're at over 300.
I guess my question is to our state and local public health colleagues. On the previous CR where we talked about we can't put the max at 180, we voted no because we can't measure past 90 or 110. How are we going to do this for this ratio? How are we going to do this for a limit of 300? I mean, I guess I'm just trying to picture how this all works and being consistent. And, the argument for saying no to that was we're going against what things were certified for. But now we're okay with 300 here. I mean, I'm not arguing with the 300 per se, but is this enforceable, I guess, is my question to our state and local colleagues.
Well, I guess right now, the proposal was that you could go above 90 if you could measure that high. So, I mean, but only if you could measure that high. So it seems like, if people are routinely measuring up to around 90, and then if you're looking at a 30-to-1 ratio, any pool that doesn't have at least a minimum of 3 parts per million free chlorine, if you're at your maximum range of your test kit, that they're in violation of that ratio. Above 90, I think it would be hard, but we still have that limit of 90 in the operational section, and then we also have the 30-to-1 ratio. So basically, anytime their free chlorine, is below. So I can see, we still have that operational limit of 90, basically that's existing. But measuring above 90, I don't know how that would work. But I think that's already a concern because of the operational limit maximum, and the fact that even with the ratio, they still can't go above 90. It's just not an imminent health hazard.
I would be in favor of this, just because it does set limits. And I don't have a problem with the 300. Sure, you're going to have a problem finding any kind of kit that will measure up to 300, but you can always do dilution, then a dilution, then a dilution. And eventually there's some math, and then you'll find it. And you're probably only going to go through that if you have a suspicion and you need to really dig into it to find the source of a problem. But if you're at that point, you have other issues already to deal with. Like Amanda said, the enforceable limit is 90, not 300. 300 is an extreme case. So I would be in favor of this as written.
Was one of the other CRs without the 300? But with the same?
Yeah. We had already addressed that one, but.
If you take out
we
the
were gonna leave it to
300,
the group.
if you take out the 300 limit though, and you keep the 45:1, you could potentially hit 300 at 6 parts per million chlorine, or almost 7 parts per million chlorine, which in some jurisdictions would be allowable. And so you could hit that toxicity level. So I think it's worth keeping the 300 in.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, they'd have flown. You know, there's already the 90 limit operationally.
If we're hitting the limit then before that with the ratio, then why would we allow them to have that ratio if it's toxic and it's an imminent health hazard? You wouldn't be able to operate at 6 parts per million with whatever the other number was. I don't know. There's for us, there's a difference between regulating the values and then closing somebody down for an imminent health hazard, right? That's the difference when looking at these values. And if we're shutting a facility down because it's an imminent health hazard, then the levels we test have to be NSF approved or certifiable, right, for legal purposes.
I'm sure they'll produce new test kits if the market calls for it. I mean, it's simple to dilute and do this and certify it. You know, NSF will make money. The test kit makers will make money. I mean, yeah, I think it's a non-issue.
And there are other testing devices that can test higher, that don't rely on dilution method. You know, there's various turbometric readers that can do so, and not turbometric, but there's other electronic testing that can be done.
Right, but the local health jurisdictions usually don't purchase. I mean, we're trying to match what the field people are using too.
Yeah. But that's where the other change request on testing, and Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, but it does reinforce the limit of 90 unless you can test higher.
Correct.
Yeah. And it's also worth noting that there's a model code where health departments can figure out and modify it based on their needs. So for example, if Texas, I'm just throwing Texas out there, right? If they decide that all of their pH folks don't have access to those meters and they keep the 90 part per million limit, I mean, that's well within their right to do.
Yeah, I get that too, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like Kevin had to drop off the call, so we have 11 members present right now, and Ellen is abstaining. as a member of the ad hoc committee. So we have 10 people voting. So essentially we're going to need 9 out of 10 people to vote to reach consensus. So do people feel ready to vote on this one?
I guess, Amanda, I think if we're going to vote yes on this, we probably should have voted yes for the previous CR.
I don't know if I'm comfortable allowing them to operate a lot higher just because they can measure for it. I still don't think it's a good idea to go above 90. I mean, we've had a limit of 90, and just because you can measure higher, I feel like there's really not much rationale that I've seen to go higher, especially for like fecal incidents and things when you have to dilute below 15. You know, if we're going to allow them up to 180, what are the chances that they're going to be willing to replenish enough water to get below 15 and then, you know, hyperchlorinate to 20 parts per million? I just don't for a long, long time. So I think there's a difference in putting a maximum limit that would require closure versus, you know, allowing them to go higher operationally.
Well, and just as a reminder, the 90 part per million limit and the MAC as it sits, that was not based on, you know, any necessarily risk data. It was based off of
the testing.
The testing from a non-dilution standpoint. So it's not like. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dewey. Go ahead, Dewey.
I was just going to mention, it's not like we had any data at the time that showed that higher levels were this really, really horrible thing. You know, so it was truly just based on, can you test for it?
But a lot of, also that it was kind of a best practice, and a lot of states had similar limits, which may be because of what you can test for, but you know, it was still, you know, I think.
Yeah.
I think the.
Yeah, I think if I. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not sure that the TRC abstaining from the previous CR, you know, really would impact this one.
Yeah. I guess where I stand, if I remember correctly, we went from 100 ppm max CYA to 90 because of the testing issue. If I remember correctly through the iterations. I think part of what I heard in the conversation when we abstained, and I keep saying no, but I mean when we abstained on the previous CR is you have nothing to back you up because that's not what the testing equipment was made to do. However, I think people don't question a check mark on an inspection, but operators go to court over being closed. And so if we're not willing to say yes to the previous CR because of testing issues, but we are willing to say it here for a closure item where things could go to court, I'm just a little torn and we're just being a bit inconsistent here. I am not a fan of CYA. It does slow disinfection rate down.
I guess with the previous CR, personally, you know, testing was one consideration. You know, Kevin had mentioned, you know, our ORP issues with operating that high, and then also, you know, concerns about allowing operational levels that high in general. So to me, testing wasn't the only issue for that CR. And then for this one, you know, if we want to throw in the operational limit of 300, you know, the local health department can determine whether or not they want to add this one. It's a little bit easier, and also I think, you know, more than likely they're going to cite them for violating the ratio before, you know, 45-to-1 ratio before they, you know, without even needing to do that, and they, you know, they might not decide to cite both. But I think, you know, they can still, I guess I don't see them as complete parallel.
I think there's an easy fix here. You know, we just adapt the language slightly. Say that the limit could be, 90 parts per million or up to 300 if you can test for it accurately. And by putting that or in there, it allows when new test kits are on the market to go up to 300. But until then, it still provides a measurable and sensible limit.
Well, that would give the impression that it is okay to operate above 90. Even without the second CR being approved, the current language states it shall remain at or below 90. That's the operational limit. I can't speak for all jurisdictions because every jurisdiction will have different criteria for when a pool is closed. But anytime a pool exceeds the operational limits, that could and should be grounds for closure, or at least at some level. These immediate closures that we're talking about, these imminent health hazards, those are only for the most extreme situations. And those should not be the criteria for when a pool is closed. Those are, again, imminent health hazards. That's if an operator sees that, they should voluntarily close and then contact their health department. And an inspector should not be using these criteria to determine whether or not to close a pool. They should be looking at operational limits. So to try and say that the pool should not be closed until it reaches 300 is not the right way to be looking at this.
I also want to point out, and while certainly we don't need to rehash the entire discussion for the model, but the model does point that, and Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, the model does point that up to the numbers we're talking about. So if we go up to the 45-to-1 ratio, right, that there's not necessarily a massive uptick in risk. So that's just something else to put in consideration. The model doesn't necessarily show a severe risk at higher levels like that.
I vaguely remember Richard presenting a table with risk based on ratio.
Yeah.
I don't have it off the top of my head.
Yeah, that would be in that June 8th recording. In the first hour, it was a pretty thorough set.
Yeah, isn't it like 15 parts per million for chlorine?
Well, the table, the model looked at a stable chlorine level, but changing values of cyanuric acid. And it stayed, so you have the whole relative risk deal. The relative risk, which again, we could probably, have more discussions on that, but the relative risk stayed relatively stable up until that 45-to-1 ratio. And the 45-to-1 ratio, once you get beyond that, is when the relative risk starts changing and becomes less stable and less predictable.
So is there anyone on the TRC who's not okay with putting in the 45-to-1 as the imminent health hazard?
Amanda, wasn't the CR we were looking at 45-to-1 or 300?
Well, it's both. But there is another, we had concerns about the way we voted last time. So there is a separate CR 6631-0003, which only has the 45-to-1 ratio, but not the 300. So, I'm trying to get a feel for if there's anyone who would would vote no on the 45-to-1 ratio to begin with. Right now we're down to 10 people, so we need to have at least 9 people, voting one way or the other to accept a CR, to recommend a vote. So I'm just trying to boil down. I think there's a couple of us who are very uncomfortable with the 300. So I'm trying to see if there's anyone that's uncomfortable with the 45-to-1, or if we can kind of, at least get consensus for that part of it.
And the revised CR from today, it says 45-to-1 or 300 or and 300?
It's a separate maximum. So if you exceed the 45-to-1 ratio, it's an imminent health hazard. It's also an imminent health hazard if you exceed 300.
So you have to meet both criteria or just one?
Just one. But essentially, if you're exceeding 300, there's a likely chance you're exceeding a 45-to-1 ratio as well, unless you're operating with a really high free chlorine level. You'd have to be operating, like 9, 10, 8 or 9 parts per million, I guess. No, not even.
I'm confused. Is the 90 ppm currently a closure limit, or there is no closure limit? Because
no, it's just the operational limit, but it's not. There is currently no closure limit in the MAHC.
So a 45-to-1 only has an implied 450 parts per million maximum. So I think the no 300 would actually be a worse scenario in terms of it would allow more CYA before closure.
Yeah, technically you could be operating at a 45-to-1 ratio. If you have 10 parts per million free chlorine, if you're not exceeding that, you could be up to 450 parts per million cyanuric acid. You're right.
Yep.
So are there any no votes as it is? I haven't heard anybody say no. Are there no votes?
I think there are a few concerns about the 300, but whether or not, I think the decision is whether, we can establish that, and then, if states want to not use that, or if there needs to be issues worked out for testing. But do people feel ready to take a vote on this one? We're well after 3. Okay, so for 6631-0005, is there anyone who would recommend a no vote on this CR? Okay, I'm going to record it as a yes vote. I know, I'll present in the summary the various concerns voiced, but I think, as Michelle said, this is a step forward for public health in general, even though there might be some issues with measuring levels that high and how that would hold up in court if the test kit's not certified to actually measure that high. But I think in general, it also brings the limit for not exceed, for keeping a limit for minimum free chlorine to a ratio as well. Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, well, thank you everyone for this additional call and for working, later. It obviously went above 2 hours again, but this will be our final call for the main group of these 529 CRs. I can't stress enough the importance of getting all your change requests in, submitted through the website, the evaluation form by next week. The 19th at the very latest, ideally, by Monday. If you have any questions or problems entering, please, don't hesitate to reach out to Dewey and myself. I sent out an updated list with all the votes that I had in so far. So if the CR you're working on doesn't have a vote in yet, just skip it, and hopefully we can scramble to get any votes from people who haven't voted yet so that we can have voting recommendations for those that are still outstanding by email. And then you'll be able to write up those change requests. And, you know, if you have any questions about writing up the change requests, feel free to reach out. Dewey had also had that meeting on Tuesday, and that's recorded. So he had sent around a link to that in terms of how to do the data entry. Dewey, do you have any other comments?
Yeah, I'll be emailing everyone individually with outstanding votes and have a copy of the voting sheet. We got to get those in so we can get all that closed out. Also, Amanda, and I apologize if I missed you talking about it, but I did get a question about the 8-7 agenda, email voting agenda. I don't have anything on that, just FYI.
The email agenda?
Yeah, I don't have anything for an 8-7 email agenda.
No, that was the one that we did like a vote on the call. So we pulled anything that we wanted to discuss, and then we did a quick consent vote as to what the champion recommended. So there was no voting sheet sent out for that one. The latest one that we did was the 30th of July.
Great, thank you for the clarification.
Okay.
And Amanda, I want to take a moment. I just want to take a moment and thank you very much for your leadership on all of this and keeping us organized and keeping us going.
Thank you.
Despite a pandemic.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, totally, Amanda.
Yes, absolutely.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
And I want to thank. I know we're not quite done, you know, with all the work, but you know, I want to thank, while we're on our final call, all of you as TRC members for the immense amount of work you've put in, for your expertise, for your passion, for your support. I just want to make sure I get that publicly stated. And I'm sure this will not be the last time I say it publicly. But y'all are just an amazing group of people. And thank you for your very, very hard work over these last few months.
Okay, with that, everybody have a good weekend.
Thanks all.
Take care.
Bye-bye.